In every age, God chooses unique men and women through whom he speaks to the world at large. A.W. Tozer was such a man in his day. Now, a quarter of a century after his death, his legend lives on, and in many ways more vividly than ever. Tozer was not a prolific writer. He labored over what he wrote. But he was published widely in the religious periodicals of his day, that is, when editors could prevail upon him to write. He wrote as sparingly as he spoke. Everything he wrote, as well as much of what he said, was lean, precise, often cryptic, but always spiritually insightful, a graphic model of the author himself. Probably the most prolific outpouring of Tozer's writings appeared in the Alliance Weekly, not the Alliance Witness. He edited the paper, the official publication of the Christian and Missionary Alliance, for 10 years. Each issue opened with an editorial by him, by all odds the most read single feature appearing in that publication, or indeed possibly in any other Christian publication during the period of his editorship. To see him at work writing was to destroy any image of the distinguished pastor, renowned lecturer, or highly respected denominational leader that he was. Tozer usually worked at a desk with a gooseneck lamp. He wore a green eye shade, much like the prototype of the cigar-chomping newspaper editor of his day. Shunning his coat, he worked in a vest with rubber bands on his arms at the elbow to pull up his shirt sleeves. Plainly, Tozer was a thinker. His sermons were no more usual than his writings. It is probably a truism to say that Tozer was not a popular speaker in the general sense of the word. His audiences, however, did appreciate what he had to say. It is also probably correct to say that in most of the churches that he pastored, the predominance was represented by blue-collar people. Yet he could speak to their needs just as well as he could titillate minds of the intelligentsia on university campuses, where he was frequently invited by intervarsity Christian fellowship groups. On the other hand, no one could ever accuse Tozer of tailoring his message to please his audience. In fact, many felt that he did exactly the opposite. A case in point is the time he was invited to speak at the annual conference of the Christian Writers Institute in Chicago. Having heard of his predilection to speak the truth as he saw it, I, as conference director, suggested to him that the purpose of these sessions was to encourage beginning writers to perfect their techniques. Looking away from me, he nodded affirmatively in an absent sort of way. This was my first experience in inviting him to speak, so I was quite unprepared for the results. A blistering attack on Christian writers who ignorantly assumed that Christian fiction was a valid means of communicating the truths of Jesus Christ. His exact words I do not remember, but the idea was simply that fiction was false, a perpetrator of error, and hence totally beneath the high art of Christian writing. I do not know what I said at the close of his address. I do know that I attempted to minimize its effect on the astonished writers who had been subject to the diatribe. Tozer could be as harsh and vitriolic in his writing as he occasionally was in his speaking. Probably the most notable example of this was his editorial in the Alliance Weekly, criticizing an expanded translation of the Book of Romans by a well-known scholar, then instructor at Moody Bible Institute. Whatever else he had to say about the book, I do not recall. One phrase, however, ignited controversy throughout the entire evangelical community. Reading the book, opined Tozer, was like trying to shave with a banana. To his credit, Tozer later repented of his brash statement. He made public apology in the editorial columns of the Alliance Weekly, but only for the unkind cut, not for his evaluation of the book. Tozer was a deeply committed man. Anyone who knew him realized this. Although he might not have been considered a theologian in the strictest sense, he applied the truths of Scripture to what he spoke, wrote, and lived to the best of his ability. He was also a very private man. The people who knew him well knew him principally on the spiritual level. He always was glad to talk with people who had spiritual problems. That is, provided they remained objective and did not get into maudlin subjects. Praying with Tozer was a unique experience. I was delighted the first time he invited me to join him in his study for a time of prayer.